The Ghosts of the Two Sisters, Part 2. We left Diddie and Jimmy in the summer of 1952. Watch Part 1 for how this story began. Diddie had just been granted a legal separation from Jimmy. She described several abusive encounters with Jimmy to obtain the separation, so this is the trigger warning for this episode. I will be discussing domestic violence and abuse and the murder scene. I won't be using very graphic language, but no matter what, it is disturbing. Please take care of yourself. The night that led Diddie to leave Jimmy was May 25th, 1952. Jimmy was drunk and pushed Diddie down while she was feeding Donald, the New Orleans item recorded in 1953. Quote, he then grabbed another of her children by a previous marriage and twisted her leg until she screamed, Mrs. Cooper testified. That January, Diddie was pregnant when Jimmy attacked her for the first time and agreed to treatment for his drinking. However, she claimed in her separation petition that he refused to go after he sobered up. Diddie said he abused her about every 2 weeks while drinking, and that she was scared of him. A friend later testified that he had been asked for help reconciling with Diddie at a party they hosted at the Quarter Two Sisters after a celebration called A Night in Old New Orleans in April 1952. That same night, Jimmy caused a fight with Diddie in front of their friends, and also claimed that they were planning a trip to the Kentucky Derby together. Diddie's maid testified that the morning of the football game, while Jimmy was playing with the baby, she heard him crying and Jimmy saying, "Shut up, shut up." She then said Diddie ran out and said Jimmy was trying to smother the baby. Jimmy denied it. Diddie's stories were corroborated by Jimmy's first wife, Millie. She had similar claims in her divorce petition of drunkenness and abuse. On December 25, 1949, Jimmy was so drunk that several people had to subdue him, including, quote, a doctor to administer a sedative to stop his violence, according to the New Orleans item. Millie attended every day of the trial. It is commonly reported that the estranged couple, Diddie and Jimmy, continued to spend time together after their separation. The stories of Diddie often include undertones of an insatiable debutante skipping from rich husband to rich husband, collecting alimonies for her trouble, as if she still wanted his attention and simultaneously was trying to extort Jimmy for a separation allowance as well. This is also the tack that the defense took in the case. The prosecution also cited the allowance as a reason for the murder, saying Jimmy did not want to pay it as he was already paying his first wife an alimony. But Diddie Cooper, master marketer, strikes again, as a key point in the testimony of Diddie's mother refutes this notion. Mrs. Wolfick testified that she visited Jimmy 10 days before Diddie's murder, and he told her that they were still seeing each other as man and wife. Apparently, in the 1950s, this would be enough to deny an abused woman a divorce, even if it wasn't true. He also said if she didn't return to him, he would throw her out on her ear and take everything she had. Diddie denied seeing him when questioned by her mother, telling her that he was a known liar. But the story that lives on insists that Diddie was still entertaining Jimmy around town as his wife while trying to extort him for a separation allowance, including partying with him at a football game the night of her murder. In reality, it seems that Jimmy was basically stalking Diddie to spend time with her, using a key he either stole from the maid or never remitted when they separated to gain access on a whim. On the evening of November 29, 1952, Jimmy was at the Uptown apartment with Diddie while she was getting ready to go out with friends to a Tulane LSU football game at the Sugar Bowl Stadium. According to her neighbors, she did not venture out much and instead focused on her children and had been working diligently campaigning for Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidential campaign. Her rare evening out started at the football game, where Jimmy tagged along. Diddie was described as cold toward her husband, only speaking to him when necessary. He asked to bring her oldest son Mackie with him to the apartment above the restaurant after the game, and Diddie made him promise to return Mackie in time for Sunday school the next day. After the game, she went with friends to a private club for a drink, then a cocktail party at a friend's house in the neighborhood, and finally, coffee with her across-the-street neighbors. She paid her babysitter around 2 a.m. The next morning, she was found dead, according to a 1956 The Times article, Quote, "The beaten body of Mrs. Cooper, clad in a blue negligee, was found on a blood-stained bed in the apartment. A gaping wound made with a blunt instrument was on her right forehead, and her throat bore numerous evidences of strangulation. There was no evidence of a break-in, and valuable items were nearby undisturbed." In addition, Diddie's brother testified that the stairs to enter were so tricky that only someone who was very familiar with the property could do it without making a disturbance. The reports concluded that Diddie must have let her killer into the apartment, setting up the circumstances that led to her murder. All of the evidence against Jimmy happened to be circumstantial, but the only suspect was Jimmy. Jimmy's alibi was that he was at the Court of Two Sisters with Mackie, Diddie's oldest child from her first marriage, and his friend Robert Riley, who both slept at the apartment above the restaurant that night and testified at trial. An employee of the restaurant had reported his car missing to police that morning. Later, when he mentioned this to Jimmy, he told him to check again, and his car had reappeared. He said that Jimmy had asked to borrow his car that night, but he never got the key from him. But Jimmy had sold the employee the car, and likely still had a key. A cigar wrapper of the kind Jimmy was known to smoke was found in the car. The employee said he did not smoke cigars, and he had just gotten his car cleaned. To this day, the courtyard at 613 Royal Street extends the length of the entire block, and so it has two entrances, one on Bourbon Street and the main entrance on Royal Street. There was some speculation that Jimmy could have snuck out or in the second entrance after borrowing the car to go undetected. Diddie's grandmother, who lived with Diddie and her children, reported that she had heard a scream that night, but assumed it was her great-granddaughter, who did not like to be put to bed. She also testified at the trial that she and Diddie had a quarrel and weren't speaking at the time, which explains why she didn't check on them. The grandmother also reported that she saw someone of Jimmy's height and build leaving the back of the apartment about the time of the murder that night. Jimmy's behavior after the murder was reported as suspicious, but today we likely would have fewer expectations on how he should act in such a situation. Everything was sensationalized in this case, but no one was arrested until a mysterious woman supplied evidence to the grand jury nearly 6 months after the murder, according to an article in the 1953 Crowley Post-Signal. She was secretly brought in through a private elevator and left with a coat and veil covering her face. Her testimony seemingly led to the indictment of Jimmy on August 5, 1953. Her identity was fiercely protected and speculated upon until she testified at the trial. She turned out to be Yvonne Evers, an undercover agent for the police, who solicited oral confessions from Cooper. She was 23 on her fourth marriage and had worked as an exotic dancer to pay off debts from a conviction for thievery in Portland, Oregon. The defense treated her so despicably that the judge had to repeatedly remind them that they could not impeach a witness by impeaching her chastity. This is because Jimmy had confessed to Yvonne several times that Diddie's murder was at his hands. She had stopped her investigation when Cooper tried to strangle her, just like Diddie was strangled, after finding her with his keys. She said she was trying to make soap impressions of the keys to prove that Jimmy still had a key to the Louisiana Avenue Parkway apartment and the porter's car, and Jimmy became enraged. She used a judo move to get away from his attack. Dr. Nicholas Chetta, the coroner, examined her and took photographs of her bruises from the strangulation. The prosecution accused Jimmy of strangling Diddie because she would not get back together with him and wanted a separation allowance to take care of her children, including Jimmy's 10-month-old son, Donald. Several articles mention it was the case of the century or the biggest murder trial in Louisiana history. Each day of the trial had multiple write-ups in each edition of the paper, including full transcripts of the testimony, the names, addresses, and occupations of all jurors, and the same for all witnesses. Cooper took the stand in his own defense and emphatically denied murdering his wife. He also claimed he always knew Yvonne Evers was a plant of the cops, and that he wasn't drinking at all the night of Diddie's murder. An all-male jury, the only possibility at the time, as it wasn't until the Supreme Court ruled on Taylor v. Louisiana in 1975, 19 years later, that women weren't excluded as a separate class for juries. The all-male jury found Jimmy innocent in about a half an hour. The courtroom erupted into applause as the verdict was read. There was a write-up about the party that was held at the Court of Two Sisters after the acquittal, with numerous mentions that Jimmy did not drink anything but coffee and water. So what happened to Jimmy? After his acquittal, he spent 2 more years running the Court of Two Sisters in the French Quarter, lost in the swirl of drunken celebrations, marriage proposals, and many sent postcards. But Jimmy couldn't stay out of trouble, and soon he became embroiled in yet another murder investigation. The governess of his now 3-year-old son, Donald, died at Charity Hospital after being found in a daze in her apartment. She lived above the Court of Two Sisters. Robert Riley and Jimmy were considered suspects in the investigation, as Riley was found with a bottle of pills he wouldn't relinquish until he spoke with Jimmy. The governess died of an overdose on sleeping pills. But on January 1st, 1956, Jimmy's body was discovered strangled to death in his apartment above the restaurant. His death, however, is solved. Newspapers reported that the coroner made a verdict of natural death due to a mysterious allergy which caused swelling in the windpipe and prevented Jimmy from breathing. Dr. Chetta, the coroner, also reported that he had enough sleeping pills in his system to kill a normal person, but he had built up a tolerance. The case against Riley was dropped after Jimmy's death. The story of Diddie Cooper is significant because even a well-known member of New Orleans high society could not prevent domestic violence from likely taking her life. And in the face of immense evidence, her social prominence could not convince a jury to provide justice for her murder. The Justice Tipsters podcast compares the story of Diddie Cooper to the recent murder of Cassandra Jones that was definitely the result of domestic violence, to draw a direct line showing that not much has changed in 70 years regarding the safety of all women and the justice they receive. I think this really drives home the point that Diddie Cooper remains timeless, her story bleeding into our world 70 years later with no barrier to separate the devastation. Please go listen to their episode about this case to learn more about Cassandra and a modern-day fight for justice. I will link it in the description. A ghost story told on the tour circuit in the French Quarter is that the ghosts of the two sisters, haunting the courtyard that refuses to shake their name, carried out justice on Jimmy that Diddie never got through the judicial system. Sisters of spirit sticking together through space and time to protect each other when the mortal realm fails us. It's easy to imagine someone as driven and talented as Diddie becoming a famous singer, or writing popular songs, shaking off the men of her past and blooming in her talent, if she had just been given the opportunity to live. When I pass by for a Creole meal in the most beautiful courtyard in the Beau Carré, I will always listen for Diddie and the governess, laughing and singing with the splendid old world sisters. But this unwanted sorority of spirit is little solace in the face of continued domestic violence and loss of life. Thank you for remembering the talented and driven Diddie with me today. I hope that clearing up a few of the myths about her allows a deeper understanding of the injustice faced by victims of domestic violence throughout time, so that we can seek the justice that will end these crimes forever. More free tours coming soon.